This is not just another airline story. This is the moment where billions in capital collide with thousands of livelihoods, and only one decision decides who walks away and who survives. Right now, behind closed doors, a handful of investors are weighing a choice that will either keep planes in the sky or ground an entire airline for good. No bailout, no second chances, just a single call that could erase decades of work in an instant. This isn't turbulence. This is free fall, and the pull-up point is seconds away. The future of an airline is rarely decided in the cabin or at the gate. It is decided quietly, deliberately, in rooms where capital speaks louder than sentiment. That is exactly where this story now sits. Spirit Airlines is no longer fighting turbulence, it is fighting gravity. And at the center of that fight stands a small group of bondholders whose decision will determine whether this airline restructures and flies forward, or whether it becomes another case study in liquidation. In a Chapter 11 process, survival is not about hope. It is about liquidity, confidence, and alignment. Spirit has already taken the hardest step any company can take, admitting that its balance sheet no longer works in its current form. The airline has cut costs, renegotiated obligations, and asked its employees to shoulder painful concessions. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff have already given back real money in the belief that restructuring, not liquidation, was the objective. That belief now hinges on the actions of creditors. Bondholders are not villains in this story. They are rational actors protecting capital. But rationality cuts both ways. When bondholders step into a restructuring, they are not simply collecting interest, they are assuming responsibility. The capital they control has the power to stabilize operations, preserve enterprise value, and protect long-term outcomes, or to shut the doors and extract whatever remains. That is the leverage they hold, and everyone involved understands it. Spirit's situation is uniquely fragile. It operates in a brutally competitive segment of aviation where margins are thin, costs are volatile, and pricing power is limited. Fuel prices, aircraft availability, and regulatory pressure have all tightened the vice. Yet despite these pressures, Spirit still represents something tangible in the market: access. Low-fare travel is not a luxury for millions of passengers. It is the difference between mobility and immobility. That access disappears the moment liquidation becomes the preferred option. This is why the current moment matters. The restructuring is not theoretical. It is nearly complete. What remains is confidence, the willingness of bondholders to continue funding the process long enough for the airline to emerge as a viable entity. Withdraw that support, and the outcome is not discipline, it is destruction. Aircraft get grounded, routes vanish overnight, and thousands of workers are left holding promises that no longer exist. Capital markets reward foresight, not impatience. Liquidation may look clean on paper, but it rarely maximizes value in practice, especially in asset-heavy businesses where timing and coordination define outcomes. Preserving an operating airline, even a leaner one, protects far more value than dismantling it piece by piece. This is not an emotional argument. It is a strategic one. The bondholders now deciding Spirit's fate are not choosing between loss and profit. They are choosing between short-term certainty and long-term value. And history is very clear about which choice ultimately proves stronger. There is a moment in every restructuring where the math is no longer the hard part. The spreadsheets are built, the scenarios are modeled, and the downside cases are painfully clear. What remains is judgment. Spirit Airlines is standing squarely in that moment. The numbers alone do not decide its fate. Conviction does. Bankruptcy is often misunderstood as failure. In reality, it is a tool, a reset, a controlled environment designed to preserve value when the existing structure no longer works. Spirit entered this process not because its planes stopped flying, but because its capital structure stopped making sense. Debt piled up faster than the operating model could absorb shocks. External forces, failed mergers, cost inflation, competitive pressure accelerated the breakdown. None of that erases the underlying reality. This is still a functioning airline with assets, demand, and relevance. The critical question now is whether those providing capital believe that relevance is worth protecting. Bondholders occupy a unique position in this process. They sit between collapse and continuation. They are senior enough to enforce discipline, yet close enough to the business to understand what disappears if the enterprise is dismantled. This is not about charity. It is about recognizing that value is not static. It can either be harvested or compounded. Liquidation harvests, restructuring compounds. Spirit's employees understand this better than anyone. That is why pilots and staff have stepped forward publicly, not with slogans, but with concessions. They have already paid the price of restructuring in real terms, reduced compensation, altered contracts, uncertain futures. People do not make those sacrifices unless they believe the effort leads somewhere. Their message is simple. The operational side has done its part. Now capital must decide whether it will do the same. In aviation, timing is everything. An airline does not unwind gracefully. The moment funding dries up, confidence evaporates. Vendors tighten terms. Aircraft availability becomes a problem. Customers book elsewhere. What could have been a viable reorganization turns into a rapid collapse. That is why halfway measures do not work. Either a restructuring is fully supported or it fails. There is also a broader consequence that cannot be ignored. Low-cost carriers play a critical role in the travel ecosystem. They keep pricing honestly. They expand access. They force efficiency across the industry. Remove one and the impact is not theoretical. Fares rise, routes shrink, and consumers lose leverage. That effect extends far beyond a single balance sheet. The disciplined choice is not always the harshest one. Discipline can also mean patience, allowing a business with real demand to stabilize under a sustainable structure. Bondholders who understand this are not betting on sentiment, they are betting on outcomes. They are acknowledging that preserving an operating airline, even a smaller one, often produces greater recovery than breaking it apart under pressure. This decision will not be remembered for its legal technicalities. It will be remembered for its clarity. Either capital stepped in to finish what restructuring began, or it walked away at the moment value could still be saved. In markets, reputations are built on moments like this. When judgment matters more than leverage and leadership matters more than control, markets have a way of revealing who understands risk and who merely reacts to it. Spirit Airlines is now a live test of that distinction. This situation is not about predicting the future of air travel. It is about deciding whether uncertainty is managed or abandoned. And that decision sits squarely with those who control the capital. An airline in bankruptcy is often described as fragile. That is true, but it is also incomplete. Fragile systems can still function if they are supported correctly. Spirit's aircraft are flying. Customers are booking. Crews are showing up every day. What is fragile is not the operation. It is the confidence that the operation will be allowed to continue. Confidence, once lost, is far more expensive to restore than any line item on a balance sheet. The current restructuring exists for one reason: to preserve enterprise value while correcting financial excess. The company has already acknowledged its mistakes. It has renegotiated obligations, reduced costs, and stripped the model down to its essentials. That process is not theoretical. It is underway. What remains is the most difficult part of any turnaround: patience from those who hold power. Bondholders often focus on downside protection, and rightly so. But in moments the real risk is not loss. It is miscalculation. Liquidation is frequently mistaken for certainty. In practice, it introduces chaos. Assets are sold under pressure. Timing is dictated by urgency, not optimization. Recovery values shrink as soon as the market senses distress. What looks clean in a term sheet becomes messy in reality. Spirit's value is not in its debt instruments. It is in its continuity. Aircraft leases, route authorities, train crews, airport access, these are not assets that survive dismantling intact. They only retain value when the airline remains whole. Once broken apart, they are discounted, delayed, and diluted. Anyone who has navigated complex unwinds understands this instinctively. There is also the issue of signaling. Capital does not operate in isolation. Decisions made here will echo across future restructurings. When stakeholders step up and finish a restructuring they committed to, markets remember. When they exit at the final mile, markets remember that too. Credibility compounds just like capital does, or erodes just as quickly. This moment also exposes a deeper truth about leverage. Real leverage is not forcing an outcome, it is shaping one. Supporting a restructuring through completion does not eliminate risk, but it controls it. It transforms uncertainty into optionality. It preserves the ability to adjust, refine, and recover as conditions improve. Walking away removes all of that flexibility. Spirit does not need optimism. It needs alignment. The workforce has aligned. Management has aligned. The court process has aligned. What remains is whether capital will align with the same objective it originally endorsed: emergence, not extinction. In the end, this decision will define more than the fate of a single airline. It will define how responsibility is interpreted when capital meets consequence. The strongest players in any market are not those who avoid hard moments. They are the ones who navigate them with discipline, foresight, and the confidence to see value where others only see risk. Power in markets is rarely loud. It does not announce itself with headlines or speeches. It operates quietly through timing, through restraint, through decisions that shape outcomes long after the noise fades. The situation surrounding Spirit Airlines is one of those moments. What happens next will not be driven by emotion, but by how responsibility is interpreted when control is absolute. Bankruptcy creates a narrow corridor where options still exist. Outside of it, choices collapse quickly. Spirit is moving through that corridor now. The airline has already conceded that its previous structure was unsustainable. It has accepted oversight, scrutiny, and constraint in exchange for the opportunity to reset. That opportunity, however, is not permanent. It expires the moment the capital decides that preservation is no longer worth the effort. Those holding the debt understand the leverage they possess. Funding determines momentum. Momentum determines confidence. Confidence determines survival. Break that chain at any point, and the outcome is irreversible. In aviation, there is no slow unwind. Planes stop flying, systems go dark, and value evaporates faster than models ever predict. This is why the final phase of a restructuring matters more than the first. Early commitment is easy. Finishing is hard. It requires enduring discomfort, uncertainty, and external pressure. It requires recognizing that the final stretch is where value is either secured or surrendered. Many restructurings fail not because the plan was flawed, but because support weakened before the plan could mature. Spirit's workforce has already crossed that line of discomfort. They made concessions under the assumption that survival was the shared objective. Those concessions were not symbolic, they were material. That matters because it signals alignment. When labor aligns with restructuring, it removes one of the biggest variables that typically destroys turnarounds. What remains is execution and time. Time, however, is not neutral. It either works for you or against you. Continued funding allows the airline to stabilize operations, reassure partners, and maintain customer trust. Withdrawn support accelerates collapse. There is no middle ground where an airline can hover indefinitely. Aviation rewards decisiveness, not hesitation. There is also a strategic dimension that goes beyond this single case. Low-cost carriers exert pressure across the entire industry. They force efficiency. They discipline pricing. Their presence benefits consumers and keeps larger competitors honest. Removing one alters the equilibrium. That shift does not show up immediately on a balance sheet, but it becomes visible over time in higher fares and reduced access. The most disciplined capital understands that influence matters as much as outcome. Preserving an operating airline is not about sentimentality. It is about maintaining structure in a market that depends on it. Liquidation may satisfy a narrow recovery calculation, but it weakens the broader system that ultimately supports value creation. This moment is not about whether Spirit deserves to survive. Markets do not operate on deserving. They operate on consequence. The consequence of sustained support is optionality, stability, and potential recovery. The consequence of withdrawal is finality. The strongest decision makers recognize when restraint is power. They understand that control is most effective when it is exercised with intention, not urgency. When this chapter closes, it will be clear who viewed capital as a tool for shaping outcomes and who treated it as an exit. Every crisis eventually strips away the illusion of choice, revealing what truly matters. Spirit Airlines has reached that point. The debate is no longer about strategy, branding, or market cycles. It is about whether continuity has value and whether those with the power to preserve it are willing to act with conviction. In moments like this, capital is not passive. It sets the direction of gravity. Continued support allows an enterprise to stabilize, adapt, and emerge leaner but functional. Withdraw that support and gravity does the rest. The collapse is swift, unforgiving, and final. This is not a theoretical risk. It is the natural outcome of removing confidence from a system that depends on it. What makes this decision consequential is not just the airline itself, but the signal it sends. Markets learn from behavior, not statements. When capital stands behind a restructuring through its most difficult phase, it reinforces trust in the process. When it steps away at the threshold of completion, it undermines the very framework that allows complex businesses to survive shocks. The precedent matters. Spirit's restructuring has already absorbed much of the pain required to reset the business. Costs have been addressed. Obligations have been renegotiated. The workforce has accepted uncertainty in exchange for the promise of survival. These are not small achievements. They are the foundation upon which recovery is built. Abandoning the process now does not avoid risk. It crystallizes loss. Liquidation is often framed as discipline, but discipline without perspective becomes destruction. Breaking apart an airline does not preserve value. It redistributes it under pressure. Aircraft are returned or sold at discounts. Routes vanish. Skilled labor disperses. What took decades to assemble disappears in weeks. The reality of recovery math rarely matches the clean appearance it has on paper. There is also a broader economic truth at play. Airlines are a connective infrastructure. They bind regions, support tourism, enable business, and sustain employment far beyond their own payrolls. When one fails, the shock extends outward to airports, suppliers, local economies, and consumers who lose access and choice. These secondary effects are real, even if they don't appear in a creditor's recovery schedule. Strong capital does not confuse patience with weakness. It understands that the final stage of a restructuring is where leverage is greatest, not to force collapse, but to shape outcome. Supporting continuity preserves optionality. It allows the business to verify whether the reset was successful. It keeps value alive long enough to be measured honestly. This is ultimately a test of judgment, not whether the airline was perfectly run in the past. It wasn't. Not whether the environment is challenging. It is. The test is whether those in control recognize that unfinished restructurings destroy more value than they save. History does not remember who exited first. It remembers who understood the moment. When the outcome is finally written, it will reflect whether capital chose immediacy over impact, or whether it exercised the confidence to see a difficult process through to its logical conclusion. So here we are at the edge of a decision that won't just close a chapter but define an era. When the final vote is cast, it won't simply decide the fate of an airline. It will reveal what kind of power truly drives the market, the kind that exists at the first sign of pressure, or the kind that steps forward when the stakes are highest. Because in the end, this story won't be remembered for numbers on a balance sheet. It will be remembered for one choice, made in silence, that determined whether an airline flew into its future or disappeared from the sky forever.